Okay, so we'll talk about ancient combat. In the ancient world, when it came to swords in general, they were more like stabbing daggers than slashing sort of swords that a knight would use. While the Romans certainly eventually had slashing swords that they used more often, most of the time with the Greeks and the Romans, these bronze swords, they weren't actually sharp on the edge. They were only sharp on the tip, and they were for stabbing behind a shield in close quarters combat. So these giant bastard swords and broadswords and two-handed swords we think of from medieval knights, they weren't really around so much in the ancient world. We did have like Gauls who had rather large two-handed swords, but they were very awkward and somewhat unique. Large swords back in ancient times were usually made with a poor metal, and so when large swords were actually used, they would be used a couple times, then have to be set on the ground and re-straightened with the foot. So you can imagine a large celt and a loincloth, like Conan the Barbarian swinging around a giant two-handed sword. After a couple of bashes atop some Roman shields, it would have a big question mark shape in it, like it would be crooked. And then they'd have to take that two-handed sword on the ground and kick it back into shape. So those large swords weren't the best. You would have rather large men wielding these giant swords, and they would take psychedelic drugs and just go ape, basically. The legend of the Berserker is our source for some of that information. But we're not too concerned with the big barbaric types that we would encounter in the medieval world, or even Caesar would have came upon. But we're going to talk mainly about what we've been talking about: Mesopotamia, the Assyrians, the Syrians, the Jews, the Romans, the Greeks, and we're just going to talk about ancient combat. Our first main question is right here. Explain Greek innovations of warfare and how it differed from Persian warfare. And what this convenient little question will do for you is it will allow you to look at ancient warfare and compare it. So you'll have to already know about, what the Mesopotamians were doing when it came to war, and you'll have to be able to describe what the Greeks did differently. So you'll have to know both pre-Greek and Greek information for this. And then when we have time next week, we'll talk about Roman innovations. Greek innovations of warfare and how it differed from Persian warfare. When we say Persian warfare, that's actually the last great Near Eastern empire prior to the rise of Alexander and the Greeks and the Romans. So when we talk about the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Hittites and everyone else, the Chaldeans, the Elamites, the Persians, those were all empires that rose and fell, generally around Mesopotamia, but these large empires would control huge amounts of land all over the Near East, Turkey, parts of Greece, the barbaric north, parts of North Africa, and that sort of thing. So when we say Persians, in a way, and I know many of you already realize this from past lectures in this class, is that the Persians, when we say the Persians, we're kind of saying all those Near Eastern empires in a way, because the Persians were kind of the last manifestation of those empires before Alexander the Great. So when we say Persian warfare, we're kind of talking about just Mesopotamian in general, okay? But we'll use more examples from the Persian Empire because they're the ones fighting with the Greeks. So that's kind of the breakdown, big picture of what's happening with that. Now, warfare in the civilized world, meaning post-Neolithic in these early Sumerian cities all the way up to Babylonian empires, you have class heavily tied in to warfare. So while anyone of any class can go to war, generally you have what class of people going to war, say for a city or to take another city? What class is doing that? Not today, of course. It's a little bit different today. The aristocrats are the ones that are going to war against other cities and pillaging and that sort of thing. I mean, even your nomadic tribes, they were your aristocrats who were, at the head of those pillaging units. So make no mistake, it was your wealthy landowners, your privileged nobility who would go out and lead these great armies. When empires begin to develop and get really big, like beyond the city-state, then you will have more infantry who are not nobility, of course. They're more like servants of the military. They're your cannon fodder. They're the ones who shoot the bows and arrows. The Greeks are a lot different than that, and I'll explain why here in a bit, but I'll keep going with the older styles of combat. And so what's interesting is even after the Greek reemergence, which we already know about, aristocrats were still the ones going to war. But it wasn't until the hoplite innovation that started to dwindle off. You got more middle-class landholders, non-aristocrats, who began conducting war. But that's much later. That's what kind of makes the Greeks special. So as long as you can kind of understand how an aristocrat would be the one that monopolizes war, not the peasant, there are some real obvious reasons for that, I think. Number one, you don't want to arm the peasantry. Aristocrats have what you might say leisure time to pursue the arts of war. Horseback combat is 10 times more effective, we might say. I'm not sure scientifically how more effective, but I'll just venture a guess. Fighting on top of a horse is 10 times better than being off the horse. And so your best warriors, your nobles, they were almost always on top of that horse. Or in some places they were on chariots, especially if they were long-range archers and that sort of thing. So the horse is almost always tied in with the aristocrat. They're highly mobile. They're not going to be caught off the horse and killed. They need to be able to break a line and get out, or be able to get across the field to communicate orders and that sort of thing. So the aristocrats, you needed to be wealthy to even have a horse. You had to have free land for a horse. Horses and cattle in general, actually large cows, are very destructive to agricultural land because they're so heavy. So if you're going to keep horses on a plot, you need land that you're not using for farming. Again, you have to be wealthy to do that, say in ancient Greece, or really anywhere else in ancient times. You had to be wealthy to really be an effective soldier, unless the king was paying for your armor and your weapons, right? So it was the aristocrats who had the money and the wealth early on. Laborers, not so much, but the aristocrats had a reason to monopolize war, to not arm the peasants because they had wealth and leisure time to spend on things like warfare. Also, well, they're the ones who cared, right, if the city was overthrown, because they were the privileged ones, not the farmers, not the masses of servants and farmers, say in Egypt or Samaria, who were, digging the irrigation wells and doing the harvesting. They're not the ones who fight. You need those people to do their job. So class is tied in very early with that. Let me go ahead and review some of the weapons, or what you might say tools, and I'll just review those. We want to think with early civilization, we almost always have to start with the New Stone Age, the Neolithic era, because that's where we get, really through archaeology, some of our first weapons. And this is pretty obvious, but I'll go ahead and just briefly skim over those. So our earliest weapons, we have to think this is pre-metal, right? So it's really just materials you can find in nature that you don't have to melt down first, right? So it's later, when we have copper and bronze weapons, that we have to melt those down to make that happen. We don't get iron right away because it's actually much more difficult to harvest iron naturally from the earth, and it takes a much higher temperature to forge iron. So some of your earliest elements, wood. Wood will always be important in the ancient world because all of your spears and your bows, and for, say, the Persians, even armor, wood was very important. So all these spears, and even the most advanced spear, the Sarissa, which was up to 18 feet long, was made out of very special Cornwall type tree that was very flexible but could get very long. So wood was always a major investment in war. When you want to build a quick wall, like for example with the Greeks, they were known to build very quick walls, meaning they put up a wall real quick, a day ahead of time, and you can manipulate the battlefield ahead of time, keep somebody from charging out of flank simply because you have a wooden wall there. Siege engines are created by wood, usually local wood, close to the area that you're attacking. You would have troops go out, harvest timber, and build these siege machines. So you might think of just taking a bunch of wood and creating a giant tower on top of wheels where troops or archers can get on top of and shoot arrows off of and get over a wall, that sort of thing. So wood will always be very important. Stone, really some of your first weapons, some of your first mace heads, even your first arrowheads and stabby spears. We probably are familiar with images of that. Glass, you do see some glass like obsidian with certain cultures, especially South America. We see obsidian weapons. Glass gets quite sharp, so you can create a very nice slicing effect. Matter of fact, there's a scalpel that's been around for a couple decades that some doctors use. It's made out of obsidian simply because it gets a nicer, cleaner cut. But of course, the problem with glass is you can't really use it for blocking or anything since it's so breakable. And of course, stone, I mentioned the mace heads, but you can easily shape a stone, tie it to a piece of wood or a piece of bone, and make a mace out of it fairly easily. Now, with your metals, copper is readily available, and copper is really your first metal that you see that people are using to melt down and make jewelry, and really any metal ornamentation. Copper is your first. So if you're into archaeology, at a certain era, the only metal you're going to see is copper. It's the most flexible, most weak. You can make smaller weapons out of them, arrowheads, that sort of thing. But as most of us know, copper, really weak. It won't keep an edge very well. Bronze is actually made out of copper, but you need tin. Tin is rather difficult to come by. And so in the Bronze Age, metal and metal trade is so fundamentally important to the health of an empire, to the military, to the wealth of the emperor, that tin became so heavily sought after that there were mines all the way in Cornwall, in southern England, where Phoenicians and Greeks would mine tin and bring back all the way around the continent, around Spain, and trade it in the Mediterranean, just so they could have ample supply of bronze. Tin was rather difficult to come about, so we were combining those two. So you can see that bronze is so much more advanced than copper use. There was a great leap in metal technology. Now, iron comes along, and I don't have it up here, but one thing you'll want to know about iron is that most iron weapons you see in the Bronze Age are from meteorites. Now, every once in a while you read an article, and especially in the age of social media, somebody will say, oh, dagger of King Tut was found to be made out of a meteorite. And then people will retweet it and like it on Facebook and say, hey, how crazy is that? Well, that was from that era, most iron weapons were from a meteorite, I guess they're called. But it's more readily available, iron is. But to go into nature and find iron, you have to learn to identify where it is. And you didn't learn that until much later. It was actually a guarded secret for a while among some cultures once they discovered it. But the secret is to look for rust. Now, I guess most of the weapons really from these early eras are some of the most obvious, and even those that we have today, like the bow and arrow, axes and spears, and the blades for stabbing only. That's an important point because of the type of metal that we have that I described. But then we have this word here. Does anyone know what this is? Atlatl. The atlatl is actually an instrument. Maybe it looks like a long pipe, kind of, depending on the size. And you'll actually hold it right here. You'll stick your spear into it. And this was common. You'll see this with primitive cultures, not just civilized cultures. And it allows you to accurately, without much body motion, so in other words, you can run or go up a tree. And you just use the atlatl to accurately throw that spear up. You just go whoop, and it'll make an arc. And you can use it for hunting, you can use it for war. But that's an interesting tool that was actually quite common in ancient civilizations and even pre-civilization times that you might want to know about. The atlatl, very interesting. Missouri's kind of leading the whole spear atlatl thing, aren't they? I've been following them, they're very interesting. If you drive by MU every once in a while, there's a group that practices spear throwing and atlatl skills at Mizzou, right at Peace Park. I'm going to go ahead and address chariots now. In some cultures, the chariot wasn't really used for combat directly as much as a transportation vehicle. Like when you read the epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the heroes are riding on the chariots, stopping and getting off, and then doing combat. So in some cultures, the chariot is used just a little differently. So we think that the chariot actually comes from nomadic horse riding peoples of the north. So these are your peoples who militarized the Assyrians early. The Assyrians became a great power because they were being raided so much from these horse riding pillagers, nomads of the steppes, that they militarized early. And so we think that the chariot actually came from these sort of northern barbarians. And then the Assyrians were the ones in Mesopotamia to get it really first. So that's why they think it came from the north. The Assyrians got it first. The Assyrians developed a great chariot that could be quite wide. The Assyrians, during their empire, they could field very large forces. And that is really the advantage of some of these empires, is they're not necessarily better fighters, they just put more bodies on the field. They overwhelm their enemy. And a lot of their units are foreign units they've captured and conquered already. So that's kind of how an empire works. But something the Assyrians would do is they would actually determine a battlefield ahead of time, and they would have to go out days ahead of time and flatten the field for battle. If you don't have a flat field, you can't use a chariot. Horrible things happen if you hit a ditch or a rather large rock on a chariot. You know, the people on it are flung off and they are usually injured. So chariots are kind of high maintenance for many reasons, and in terms of especially having to go out and level the field ahead of time. So you see nobility, wealthy empires fielding these chariots. If you see a reference of an empire who had chariots, they fought with chariots a lot. They were spending quite a bit of money and going through a lot of trouble just to do that. Chariot fighting, when they would fight off the chariot, you had archer units. The Assyrians, most of these Mesopotamian empires, including the Persians, were really big into archers. And that's what you would get. You'd get these lightning units on the back of a chariot who'd fire their arrows, flanking the opponent or tearing through their lines. And what's interesting, though, is when the Egyptians got the chariot, they made it much smaller, more agile. They were still using it for shooting arrows, for archers. But when the Egyptians got a hold of that chariot, yeah, it became much smaller, so lower maintenance, so quicker as well. And so we actually get an evolution of the chariot. And so by the time the chariots get to the classical Greeks, so I talked about the Homeric Greeks who would use it to go to the battlefield and get off of it. By the time chariots are mentioned in the classical Greek world, they're just used for transportation or for racing. So not really a whole lot to do with combat at that point. Matter of fact, when a girl would get married, they would usually have a chariot or rent a chariot so the chariot could ceremonially take the girl to her new husband's house. And so she would leave her house on the back of the chariot and ride to her husband's house. So by the time of the classical era, chariots were used quite as much at all. Let's keep going. Missile weapons. Missile weapons, that just means anything that's thrown into the air. Slings. A sling, we know this usually from Sunday school, David and Goliath. You take a stone or some sort of weighted object, usually spherical, and you'll place it in a leather strap which has two handles that go off each side. There are other variations, but that's the normal one. And the sling actually takes a lot of time to really get good at it and master it. You can do a lot of damage, but you have to master it. And so the people that we see with the slings are actually shepherds. Like we see that David was a shepherd in the Old Testament, and he was really good on a sling. Well, there's a lot of truth there in the sense that, start talking about the Old Testament and it goes off. Okay, it's a sign. And we actually see that with shepherds. Now, shepherds would use the sling, especially if there's a wolf, coyote, wild dog attacking their sheep or what have you. They would need to be able to take out the coyote or wolf with their sling bullet. By twirling this leather object, letting go of one end, and then that projectile is released. And so shepherds would get so good at this because they would spend all day just out in the field. They're basically just watching the flocks or transporting the flocks. A lot of free time. And it was thought that shepherds would just practice with their slings all the time, because they would get crazy good at it. We don't know how else they would get good at it without practicing and lots of repetition. But shepherds were known to be able to hit, say, a wild dog on the skull from, maybe 50 yards away or a little bit more, and be able to kill the beast. It takes a crazy amount of accuracy and skill. But you take someone like that to the battlefield, they can be quite handy. So here's your caveat, though. It's not the nobility who were good at slings. You had smaller units. Historians often call them Peltasts. They would throw things. They would pelt things. Like we talk about pelting people with things. They were Peltasts. And they were the ones who were usually poor. They couldn't afford armor, but they would be recruited into a military unit, sometimes temporarily. Maybe they were just local shepherds or what have you. And they would just throw things. So some of these people were just really good at a sling. Some were really good at small spears. Some were really good archers. It depended on what culture you were from. And so early empires would recognize this and would allow people who were good at the sling to be a slinger. People who are good at archery, be an archer. So you wouldn't necessarily train them yourselves, except in terms of, formations and movement. So when we see the idea of the sling and certain archers, we get a change in class. We were talking about these poorer, more mobile units. They might come in at the beginning of a battle, throw their weapons, and then by the time the two actual units come closer, these Peltasts are gone. They're way in the back. Or they've already done their part, and they're just going to attack on the flank, or they just go home. This leads to certain spear types. We'll talk about the Roman innovation of spears, but you have a wide variety of spears. You have really small 3-foot spears that the Peltasts under Julius Caesar would use. They were a super thin tip that would actually bend and break so the enemy couldn't throw them back. But they were super light, so you could hold a bundle and throw them really easily and then disappear to the back of the line. You also had your very large spears like the 18-foot Sarissa, which in a phalanx unit, the 18-foot Sarissa would give you a huge advantage by simply having more spear tips ahead of the front line, because you would have more spears. Because in a phalanx, you're actually holding your spear and it's in front of the person in front of you. So in front of me are actual several spear tips from the people behind me. So the Sarissa, because they're longer now, I would have more spear tips between me facing away from me and my opponents. So with the longer spears, you get more spear tips in front. All right? So you get changes in spear length based on formation. Certain advantages in war technology are because of changes in the spear. With archers, we have mainly short bows in the ancient world. You do see long bows. You see longbowmen on the back of chariots with the Assyrians, but mainly short bow archers. Some of your sharpshooters were in the archery world. The Scythians, they were a sort of what the Athenians would consider a barbaric tribe. The Scythians from the north, the Athenians would actually take some of them as slaves, and they were basically the Athenian police force. They would go around the walls of Athens, and they were sharpshooters. So if there were people at the walls or criminals or whatever, they could just take their little bent bows, almost had like a heart-shaped type bow, and they would just fling them off, and had an uncanny amount of arrows they could shoot within a minute. Just ting, 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 ting. And they would practice for this all the time. But again, it has to do with what culture they're from. They grow up learning this war technology. So they were a real valuable asset. And so that's kind of the short bow is the main bow weapon at the time. And I already used this example, but I'll clarify it. The idea of imperial warfare, there's an advantage in numbers. When we get to the Greco-Persian wars, the Persians are fielding many more troops than the Greeks. Many, many, many more troops than the Greeks. This usually works. Most of these troops are archers, Peltasts, so you can fill the sky with spears and arrows and not even come to one-on-one combat. That was the real big thing with the Persians, actually, is these just giant units of archers. They would just fill the sky with arrows, blacken the sky with arrows. So with imperial warfare, we have a huge advantage in numbers. But the Greeks could hold their own. They were less troops on the field, but there were some major differences there. So the significance of the Greeks versus the Persians, especially during the Greco-Persian wars, this is where we get the Battle of Thermopylae, or the movie 300, Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Salamis, that sort of thing. So with the Persians, we'll talk about class differences first. So your main leaders of the Persians are, of course, aristocratic, but there are these just huge bodies of foreigners. that have already been conquered by the Persians who are fighting for the Persians. Now, there doesn't seem to be a problem with loyalty there. Like, in other words, these people who have been conquered by the Persians, they're not fleeing to the opposite side. They're not becoming friends with the Greeks. They're fairly fully integrated. That's not a problem. But what we get when we study law and government in Athens, we see that the hoplites are different. They're different warriors. They want more of a say in government because they're not the aristocrats. But they become very important, and they're your landholders. They might not be super wealthy, but they can afford their own armor. And so class differences is that the Greeks would fill the field with men who owned the land they were fighting on, essentially, or, they would fight off their own land too. But they had more to lose. They would lose everything if they lost, whereas you have all these foreigners fighting in the military. If they survive, they're just going to go back to wherever part of the world, whatever corner of the Persian Empire they live in. So one big advantage is that because your Greek hoplites were middle class, they could afford better armor. Basically, all these archers that the Persians would put on the field were basically wearing light armor, oftentimes made out of like what we might call a wicker, or like a wooden wicker sort of vegetable armor, really, wooden armor. But the hoplites were armed with bronze armor. They all bought their own armor and big hoplite shields. And the Greeks would have basically their armor. They weren't as heavily armored as, say, a medieval knight, but their basic armor, they would have a breastpiece, a chest piece. They would have a helmet, solid bronze. They would have basically your medal that would go around the forearm. And then you would have your greaves, which are basically giant shin guards. But you wouldn't have armor, say, for your thighs and parts of your arm. You wouldn't necessarily have metal over your hand. But we say they were heavily armored. That's in comparison to the Persians, not medieval knights. But if we were to look at a hoplite warrior today, we would say, yeah, they're wearing metal armor, but they're not totally protected. But what we know about their armor is that they had to be protected from the front. So you didn't necessarily need heavy armor around your thighs. You wanted to be mobile. But it's the shield would be protecting your legs, anyway, and parts of your arms. So it was very functional, but not too heavy that they couldn't move. So it was like heavy armor, but it was sparse so they could move. Differences in war tools, one being the heavy armor. That, I think, is one of the main differences. One Greek could just mow down many Persians because of their armor, even if they were less skilled. Chances are, when it came to hand-to-hand combat, the Greek was more skilled because that was their normal mode of combat, usually with a spear, sometimes with their short sword, whereas someone in a Persian unit might only really have archery skills. So when it came to getting close, the Greeks had several advantages. Again, the spear, you want to think in terms of the Greek phalanx. They were tightly packed. And so one of the advantages that the Greek phalanx had is that they would get really close together with their heavy armor and charge at the enemy units. And so if you charge at an enemy unit, if you're tightly packed, you can basically break that front line and divide that one enemy unit. And once you divide an enemy unit, they're much more weaker. You break up a bunch of infantrymen, they're no longer able to fight together. You can sort of divide and conquer is actually a really good phrase to illustrate that. You're dividing and conquering. So if you can split up enemy units, then you can easily take them out as individual cells. And so the Greek phalanx did that very well, especially accompanied with their heavy armor. So just to highlight the Greek innovations in warfare, you had your phalanx unit, tightly packed, heavy armor. It had to do with momentum. And momentum is acceleration times mass. So to have good momentum, you not only need speed, but you need weight. Greek armor, hoplite armor, fits that definition perfectly. It's heavy armor, but they're highly mobile, so they could be both heavy and fast. So the phalanx and the Greek style of armor went together really well. The shield is actually called a hoplite shield. It's different than earlier Greek shields because not only are you putting the arm through a central strap that's right in the middle of the shield, there's another strap on the inside edge of the shield. So now you have an entire forearm grip in the shield instead of just a single hand grip. and fighting here, you now can have a bigger shield because it's closer to your center and you have more structure to stabilize that. And that strap, that one single strap, is called a hoplite. And because of the name of that strap, because of that one innovation, the placement of the strap, they named the shield after it. And then they named the warrior itself after it. So a hoplite warrior is named after a leather strap, essentially, even though people call the shield a hoplite shield. So kind of interesting there. The heavy bronze armor. And so let's talk about these other two innovations. The Sarissa I've already spoken about. That was innovated by Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. And he simply innovated a longer spear. Now, one of the problems with this is if you want an 18-foot spear, you have to find the right kind of wood. It'll break, it'll bend. And he finally discovered the cornel, a type of cornel tree that could do that. So this is innovation he had thought about and experimented with, I think. And this really changed things because there are more spear tips now in front of that front line, it gives you a huge advantage. And so we're only talking about increasing the spear, depending on what type of spear, by, only maybe several feet. But such a small difference, such a small change, made a huge difference. Sometimes that's the way war technology goes in the ancient world. A tiny change in the way a unit operates makes a huge difference. In the world today, gosh, not so much, right? We have to actually advance our war technology in much greater leaps, or that's what we do, at least. Whereas it was such a small change that Philip made to the unit, and it made a huge difference. That's the Sarissa type spear. One, and this is kind of an unusual innovation, the sacred band. The Persians had actually been sort of tormenting the Greeks over the course of a couple hundred years, but never successfully conquering them. The Persians always had a lot of trouble conquering the Greeks simply because of the things I mentioned. The hoplite warrior, their style of fighting, their attitude on it in general. And the sacred band was innovated once Greek had become greatly militarized. The Athenian Empire had already fallen, the Spartans were really strong, and it's right before Philip of Macedon basically conquers all of Greece, and then his son Alexander conquers all of Persia. What's happening with the sacred band is sort of an experiment. Theban generals decide, hey, how do we make the ultimate warrior unit? The ultimate Greek warrior unit were the Spartans. Before, they were professional full-time soldiers who trained all the time. They weren't even really allowed to live with their wives. They lived in the barracks. So the Spartans were very unusual. Most Greeks were not full-time soldiers. They went and farmed in the harvest season and the planting season. And so the Thebans were imitating the Spartans in a way. They were becoming the big military force. They were creating professional standing armies. And what they did with the sacred band, this became the most powerful fighting unit in all of Greece until Alexander destroyed them. And the sacred band is an interesting formation. You had pairs of homosexual lovers who would fight side by side in a diagonal formation. So in this diagonal formation, it's actually more difficult to flank the enemy, and flanking is where you go around to the side or the back of an enemy. That's not good because your spear tips are facing the opposite direction. So it's easy to take out a unit, say this is a unit, and here are other spear tips right here. If you flank, you're going here or here, something like that, where all these spear tips are facing up this way. All right. And so the sacred band, it was designed in shape so it couldn't be flanked. And then the idea of their idea of the lovers, the male lovers, is that they would watch each other's back more. They would more viciously fight if they were fighting together and knew that they were protecting their mate or what have you. So there's a psychological aspect to it. And they were highly trained, of course. They were a professional full-time unit. Rather unusual, the sacred band. And yes, Alexander was the one to destroy them. When Alexander and his father, still alive, Philip, Thebes had rebelled against Macedon, and so Philip decided to teach them a lesson. And that they did. So Explain Greek innovations of warfare and how it differed from the Persian Empire. Okay, covered some of the basics. Hopefully it'll help. Thank you.